Consciousness is what the brain does. Nothing more. That sentence appeared in a peer-reviewed journal in 2011. I've had it memorized for years, not because I studied the paper when it was published. I found it later, after my own surgery, when I was doing what a person does after the floor drops out, looking for the exit, looking for the argument that would put the door back on its hinges. The author was a neurologist named Dr. James Farrell. He had spent 19 years publishing research on the neural correlates of consciousness, the specific brain activity that maps to awareness, experience, thought. His argument about near-death experiences was methodical, not contemptuous. He wasn't dismissive of the people who reported them. He mapped the mechanisms: cortical spreading depression to account for the tunnel and the light, memory reconstruction during reperfusion to account for the narrative coherence, oxygen deprivation to account for the emotional intensity. He published that sentence, "Consciousness is what the brain does, nothing more," as a conclusion, not a hypothesis. A conclusion, the kind that gets cited. And in March of 2017, 10 minutes into a keynote address at a consciousness research symposium in Portland, Oregon, his heart stopped. The slide still running on the projector behind him was titled, "EEG Correlates of Consciousness Cessation, Direct Evidence." I need you to hold that image. Dr. Farrell has hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a structural thickening of the heart muscle that disrupts the electrical conduction pathways and can trigger ventricular arrhythmias without any warning. It had been undiagnosed. This is not unusual. HCM can be entirely asymptomatic for decades, and it is one of the leading causes of sudden cardiac arrest in people who appear completely healthy. He was 53 years old. He had given a version of the same presentation at a smaller conference 4 months earlier without incident. He was 7 minutes and 11 seconds into his keynote when he went silent mid-sentence and collapsed forward from the podium. A cardiologist named Dr. Rachel Okonkwo was seated in the 3rd row. She reached him within 15 seconds. A hotel AED was located approximately 60 feet away in the corridor. The emergency response team arrived at roughly the 3-minute mark from collapse. V-fib on the monitor. 3 defibrillation attempts. The 3rd converted him. Return of spontaneous circulation. Total pulseless time, 8 minutes and 44 seconds. He was transported to OHSU Medical Center, intubated on arrival. He was on a ventilator for 11 hours before he could speak. When he was well enough to describe anything, the first thing he said, and he is careful with words in the way 19 years of clinical training makes a person careful. The first thing he said was, "It was nothing like I predicted." He had written about what a dying brain might generate. Random, fragmented content driven by the last firing of deprived neurons. Internally generated noise reflecting the brain's stored residue, not any external reality. Hallucinatory in the clinical sense, the kind of experience that doesn't correspond to anything outside itself. He said, "What I encountered was the opposite of that, in every possible direction." He described leaving the body, not as metaphor. He described a spatially coherent perception from a position that was not his body, above the stage, he says, and he uses that word the way someone uses a word they've tested against alternatives and kept because nothing else fits. He could see himself on the floor. He described the specific angle of his left shoulder. He could see Dr. Okonkwo. She had removed her conference blazer, the charcoal blazer she had worn since the opening session, and was on her knees doing compressions. She was wearing a deep burgundy blouse underneath it. He had only ever seen Dr. Okonkwo at professional conferences. In 2 years of occasionally overlapping at academic events, he had never seen her without a blazer. He had no basis for knowing what she wore under it. The burgundy blouse was confirmed. She had no explanation for how he knew. He also described the hotel AED, orange and gray, accurate. The model in use was a Philips HeartStart FRX, which is orange and gray, and he described the security officer who arrived with it from stage left. The officer had initially grabbed the device with the handle pointing toward the floor before reorienting it. The officer later confirmed he had held it backward. He had never deployed one in a real emergency, and his training had been on a different model. From above, while his heart was not beating. And then, he says, he went somewhere else. He spent weeks after his recovery trying to find more precise language for what followed. The word tunnel felt wrong. Borrowed from descriptions he had spent years critiquing, applied to something it didn't fit. No conventional light, no dead relatives, no beings, no figures. None of the hallucinatory content his model would have predicted from the brain's stored material. He said, "None of the things I expected appeared. What was present was entirely different. What he described was coherence. I want to explain what that means coming from him specifically. In his field, coherence refers to the synchronized coordination of neural activity across brain regions, a measure of how integrated and organized consciousness is at any given moment. More coherence correlates with more unified conscious experience. The loss of it is what his research had mapped as the loss of consciousness itself. He described the experience in that space as having a coherence that exceeded any waking state he had encountered in 53 years of conscious experience. Not vividness, not emotional intensity, not a dream-like quality. The structural organization of the experiencing itself, an integration and clarity that were, by his own internal measure, incompatible with a brain in asystole. He said, "I spent 19 years studying what I believed was consciousness. What I found in those 8 minutes suggested I had been studying something that resembled it from a significant distance. The return was jarring, not from pain. He described it as re-entering noise, as if whatever he had been in during those 8 minutes had to compress itself back into the constraints of neural processing, and that compression was the hard part. I want to tell you what the research shows, because what Dr. Farrell encountered is not his case alone. Bruce Grayson has spent decades at the University of Virginia doing the clinical work on near-death experiences that most of his field refused to touch. The NDE scale he published in 1983 remains the standard measurement instrument. One of its 4 dimensions specifically assesses the quality of thought during the experience, and the data shows a paradox that existing frameworks have not resolved. People who have near-death experiences consistently report increased clarity of thought during the period when their brain is most severely compromised. Not decreased, not fragmented. Accelerated, more organized, clearer than normal waking consciousness. Grayson has written about this directly. The paradox of enhanced cognition during profound neurological impairment is one of the features of NDE that current neuroscience cannot account for within available models. Sam Parnia, at Stony Brook University, designed the AWARE study to test precisely this question from the outside in. He placed randomly positioned visual targets near the ceilings of resuscitation rooms across 15 hospitals. 2,060 cardiac arrest patients enrolled. In the verified OBE case, the patient's accurate perceptions corresponded with a 3-minute period during which there was no heartbeat. Parnia's conclusion was specific, the standard assumption that NDE experiences occur before or after cardiac arrest, not during, is not supported by this data. Something was happening during the silence. Dr. Farrell had cited both of those studies in his own published work. He had cited them as data to be explained within the materialist framework. He reread them after March of 2017. He said, "They read differently when you have been in the condition they're describing. Here is the thing I need to tell you about why this case sits so heavily with me. I used his work, not his papers by name. I hadn't read them before my own surgery. But the argument? The framework. When a patient in my ICU described something after resuscitation and I needed language to close that conversation professionally and move to the next chart, I reached for research like his: cortical spreading depression, post hoc reconstruction, the brain doing things under duress. These weren't conclusions I had generated from first principles. I had borrowed them the way you borrow furniture when you move into a space before you understand what you actually need. I never verified the certainty I was projecting. I rented it from people who appeared more certain than I was, and I delivered it at bedsides as if it were my own. Dr. Farrell contacted me about a year after his arrest. He had found something I'd written and recognized a specific quality in it. The quality of someone trying to be honest about something that doesn't fit cleanly. We've had several conversations since. What I recognized when he described his experience was not the specific content. It was the texture of a particular kind of devastation. The devastation of an argument you've been standing on for decades when it quietly confirms it can no longer hold your weight. He told me, "The thing I cannot reconcile is this. I spent 19 years arguing that the experiencing subject is a product of neural computation, that the self which thinks it is having an experience is itself generated by the same system doing the experiencing. And what I encountered in those 8 minutes and 44 seconds was the most clearly itself I have ever been. More coherent than normal waking consciousness, more organized, more present. And the neural system that was supposed to be generating it was generating nothing." He paused before continuing. He said, "My hypothesis predicted that condition would produce cessation. It produced the opposite." In 2019, Dr. Farrell published a follow-up paper, peer-reviewed, methodologically careful, not claiming supernatural causation of any kind. The argument was a methodological critique. The existing materialist framework for consciousness is insufficient to account for the evidence generated by near-death experience research. Not a conversion. Not a theological claim. A revision of the conclusion he could no longer sign. He told me, "I cannot in good conscience publish the claim that I proved consciousness ends with the brain, because I tested that claim. On myself. Under conditions that should have produced nothing but cessation. And I got different results." The final paragraph of his 2019 paper reads, "The data gathered from near-death experience. Research does not prove the existence of consciousness independent of brain function. It does, however, create an obligation to construct a better theory than the one currently available. That is not a concession. It is the basic work of science. I've read that paragraph more times than I can count. If you have built an intellectual case against hope, if you have read the research, applied the frameworks, found the mechanisms that explain everything away, and arrived at a certainty that feels like the honest position, I am not asking you to abandon it. Dr. Farrell didn't. He still publishes. He still practices. He became a scientist who had to stop calling his hypothesis proven when the data ran the other direction. The honest position is not certainty in either direction. It is the position of a person who tested the theory and came back obligated to report what they found. Dr. Farrell got the chance most people don't get, to test his own theory on himself with the highest possible stakes, in front of 400 colleagues under a projection of his own argument. He came back with different results, and so did I.